The sound of wheels crunching over drought-hardened earth had long since faded when Clara Jenkins opened her eyes to find herself staring at the underside of a barn roof instead of the sky. Her last memory before the fever had taken her completely was of being jostled in the back of a wagon, her daughter's small hand gripping hers with desperate strength, and the overwhelming certainty that they would both die on that endless prairie road. Now the fever had broken enough for her to recognize that she was lying on something soft, that walls surrounded her, and that the September heat of 1883 Oklahoma territory pressed down like a wool blanket even in whatever shelter this was. "Mama." The voice was thin, frightened, and Clara's heart clenched as she turned her head to see 8-year-old Sarah sitting on a wooden crate beside the bed, her face pale and streaked with dried tears. "I'm here, sweetheart." Clara's voice came out as barely more than a whisper, her throat raw and aching. She tried to sit up, but her body felt as though it had been wrung out and left to dry in the sun. "Where are we?" "A man found us," Sarah said, and fresh tears welled in her eyes. "You were so sick, Mama. You wouldn't wake up, and I didn't know what to do, and then he came with his horse and he brought us here." Clara managed to push herself up on one elbow, her vision swimming as she took in her surroundings. They were in a small cabin, rough-hewn but solid, with a single window letting in the late afternoon light. The bed she lay on was simple but clean, covered with a faded quilt that had seen better years. A table stood against one wall, a cast iron stove against another, and a few shelves held basic supplies. It was the home of someone who lived simply, who needed little beyond the essentials. The door opened, and Clara's breath caught as a man stepped inside, ducking slightly to clear the frame. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that fell past his collar and eyes the color of creek water in summer. His face was weathered from sun and wind, probably somewhere in his mid-20s, and he moved with the easy grace of someone accustomed to physical labor. He stopped when he saw Clara sitting up, and something flickered across his features before settling into careful neutrality. "You're awake," he said, his voice low and rough-edged. "That's good. You had us worried there for a spell." "Thank you," Clara managed, acutely aware that she was lying in this stranger's bed, that she had no idea how she'd gotten into the nightgown she wore, that her daughter had been alone with this man for what must have been days. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't found us." "Nothing good," he said simply. He crossed to the stove and ladled water from a bucket into a tin cup. "You need to drink. You've been burning up for 3 days now. 3 days." Clara accepted the cup with shaking hands, and Sarah helped her lift it to her lips. The water was cool and sweet, the best thing she'd ever tasted. "I'm Clara Jenkins. This is my daughter, Sarah, Gideon Zeller." He nodded to Sarah. "Your girl's been real brave. Help me take care of you." Sarah ducked her head, a flush creeping into her cheeks. Clara reached out and squeezed her daughter's hand, overwhelmed by a rush of love and gratitude that this child had survived, that they both had. "We were traveling to Kingfisher," Clara said, trying to piece together the fragmented memories. "My husband died last winter, and I have a sister there. Or I thought I did. The wagon train left us when I got sick." The bitterness in her voice surprised her. She'd paid good money to join that train, had trusted those people to help her reach her sister's homestead. "They left you on the side of the road," Gideon said, and it wasn't a question. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Found your girl trying to get you to drink from a canteen. Your horse had wandered off and your wagon had a busted wheel." Clara closed her eyes, shame and anger warring in her chest. She'd failed. She'd nearly gotten her daughter killed through her own weakness, her own inability to stay healthy when it mattered most. "You couldn't help getting sick," Gideon said, as though reading her thoughts. And you're in Kingfisher now, or close enough. My ranch is about 5 miles outside town." Ranch? Clara looked around the small cabin again, seeing it with new eyes. This wasn't a ranch house. It was too small, too spare. "I run cattle on about 300 acres, Gideon said. He pulled out a chair from the table and sat, maintaining a respectful distance. "It's not much, but it's mine. Built it up over the past 4 years. Then this is your home," Clara said slowly, "and we're in your bed." Something shifted in his expression, so quick she almost missed it. "You needed it more than I did. But where have you been sleeping?" Gideon was quiet for a moment, his gaze moving to the window. "The barn's comfortable enough. I've got a good bedroll." Clara stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. "You've been sleeping in the barn for 3 days. It's no trouble." "Mr. Zeller, I cannot possibly allow you to sleep in a barn while my daughter and I occupy your home." "You've been fever sick," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "You need rest, proper rest in a real bed, and your girl needs to be near you. The barn suits me just fine." Clara opened her mouth to protest, but a wave of exhaustion crashed over her, and she sagged back against the pillow. Her body ached in ways she hadn't known were possible, and even the brief conversation had sapped what little strength she'd regained. Gideon stood, moving to the stove. "I'll heat up some broth," he said. "You need to eat, build your strength back up." Over the following days, Clara learned the rhythms of Gideon Zeller's life. He rose before dawn and worked until well after dark, tending to his cattle, mending fences, hauling water, and performing the 1,000 tasks required to keep a ranch running. He came in 3 times a day to prepare simple meals, always asking after Clara's health, checking her fever with a hand to her forehead that was surprisingly gentle for someone with such calloused palms. He spoke little, but his actions spoke volumes. He brought wildflowers that Sarah picked and put in a chipped tin cup on the table. He carved a small horse for the girl, working on it in the evenings by lamplight. He changed Clara's fever-soaked sheets without comment or embarrassment, and when she was finally strong enough to stand, he turned his back to give her privacy as Sarah helped her into a clean dress. And every night, he walked out to the barn to sleep. "He's very kind," Sarah said one evening, nearly a week after they'd arrived. Clara was finally able to sit at the table for supper, though she still tired easily. Gideon had gone to check on a cow he said might be calving soon. "He is," Clara agreed, watching through the window as Gideon's tall form moved through the gathering dusk toward the barn. Guilt gnawed at her. This man had given them everything, had disrupted his entire life for 2 strangers, and she could offer him nothing in return. When Gideon came in the next morning, Clara was already awake, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee she'd managed to make herself. He stopped in the doorway, surprise flickering across his face. "You're up early," he said. "I wanted to thank you properly," Clara said. "And to tell you that Sarah and I will be leaving today. We've imposed on your hospitality long enough." Gideon stood very still, his hand resting on the door frame. "You're not strong enough yet. I'm well enough to travel. We'll go into Kingfisher, find my sister. And if you can't find her, if she's not there," Clara hadn't let herself think about that possibility, but now it loomed before her like a chasm. What if Emma had moved on? What if the letters had been wrong or outdated? What if Clara and Sarah found themselves alone in a town full of strangers with no money and nowhere to go? "We'll manage," Clara said, lifting her chin. "We've managed this far." Gideon crossed the room and poured himself coffee, his movements deliberate. When he turned back to her, his expression was carefully neutral. "Stay, Mr. Zeller, at least until you're fully recovered. Another week, maybe 2. You're still weak and the girl needs stability." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was lower. I could use the help if you're willing. Cooking, mending. There's a vegetable garden that's gone to weeds because I don't have time for it. I'd pay you wages, room and board." Clara stared at him, her mind racing. It was an absurd proposition. She was a widow. He was an unmarried man, and the scandal of them living under the same roof would follow her forever if anyone found out. But as she looked into his steady gray eyes, she saw nothing but honest sincerity. "The barn," she said slowly. "If we stay, you take your bed back. Sarah and I can sleep in the barn." "No, Mr. Zeller, you cannot continue to sleep out there. It's not right." "I'm not turning a woman and child out of a bed," Gideon said, and there was steel beneath the quiet words. "Especially not when one of them nearly died a week ago." They stood at an impasse, and Clara felt frustration building in her chest. This stubborn, silent man had saved their lives, had given them everything, and wouldn't accept even the smallest gesture in return. "I'll build another bed," Gideon said finally. "There's timber enough, and I've got the skills. I'll set it up in the barn, make it proper. But you and your girl stay in the house where it's warm and safe." It wasn't a perfect solution, but Clara could see from the set of his jaw that he wouldn't budge. 2 weeks, she said. "Then we'll reassess." The days that followed fell into a pattern that felt almost dangerously comfortable. Clara took over the cooking and housekeeping, throwing herself into the work with determination. She scrubbed the cabin until it shone, organized Gideon's few possessions, and began reclaiming the vegetable garden from the weeds that had choked it. Sarah helped where she could, feeding the chickens and collecting eggs, slowly losing the haunted look that had shadowed her eyes since her father's death. And Gideon worked. Clara had never seen anyone work the way he did, with a steady, relentless focus that spoke of years of labor. He rode out before dawn to check his cattle, repaired the sections of fence that were wearing thin, hauled water, chopped wood, and performed 100 other tasks that Clara had never fully appreciated when her husband was alive. John had been a shopkeeper, a man of ledgers and inventory, and ranch life had been as foreign to him as it now was to her. But she was learning. She watched the way Gideon moved through his days, the economy of motion, the careful attention to details that might mean the difference between success and failure out here on the edge of civilization. Oklahoma Territory was still raw and wild in 1883, still finding its shape, and survival required a kind of toughness she was only beginning to understand. "You don't have to do that," Gideon said one afternoon, coming in to find Clara on her hands and knees scrubbing the floor. "Yes, I do," Clara said, sitting back on her heels. "You're giving us room and board. The least I can do is keep the place clean." "I meant you don't have to scrub like you're trying to take the finish off the wood." There was something that might have been amusement in his eyes. "It's not that dirty." "It is when you compare it to what it could be," Clara retorted. Then more softly, "Let me do this, Mr. Zeller, please." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Gideon." "What? My name is Gideon. You've been living in my house for 2 weeks now." "Seems like we're past formalities." Clara felt heat creep into her cheeks. "Then you should call me Clara." "Clara," he said, and the way he said it, with that rough, edged voice, made something flutter in her chest that she immediately tried to suppress. She was a widow. He was her benefactor. There could be nothing between them except gratitude and respect. But as the weeks passed and September gave way to October, Clara found herself noticing things about Gideon that had nothing to do with gratitude. The way his face softened when Sarah showed him a bird's nest she'd found. The quiet competence with which he handled the animals, his touch gentle even with the most stubborn steer. The rare smile that transformed his features from merely handsome to something that made her breath catch. She noticed, too, the toll that sleeping in the barn was taking on him. He moved more stiffly in the mornings, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of poor rest. The nights were growing colder, and even with a good bedroll, the barn couldn't be comfortable. "He's still sleeping out there," Clara said to Sarah one evening as they prepared supper together. Through the window, she could see Gideon working at his makeshift carpentry station, slowly constructing what looked like a bed frame. "He said he's almost done with the new bed," Sarah said. "He showed me. It's real pretty, Mama. He's carved designs into the headboard." Clara's throat tightened. Of course he had. Because Gideon Zeller did nothing halfway, put care and thought into everything he touched. That night, after Sarah was asleep and Clara was preparing for bed herself, she heard a sound outside that made her freeze. It was low and rhythmic, a harsh rasp that she recognized after a moment as coughing. She went to the window and peered out, and in the moonlight, she could see Gideon doubled over beside the barn, his body shaking. Without thinking, Clara grabbed her shawl and slipped outside. The October air was sharp and cold, promising frost by morning. She hurried across the yard, her bare feet silent on the hard, packed earth. "Gideon," she called softly. He straightened immediately, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "Clara, what are you doing out here? I heard you coughing. Are you all right?" "I'm fine. Just breathed in some dust wrong." But even as he spoke, another cough racked his frame. Clara moved closer, and in the moonlight she could see the flush on his cheeks, the glassy look in his eyes. She reached up without thinking and pressed her hand to his forehead. His skin was burning. "You have a fever," she said, and anger flared bright and hot in her chest. "How long have you been sick?" "It's nothing. Just a cold. A cold that you caught from sleeping in a barn for the past month because you were too stubborn to take your own bed back." Clara grabbed his arm, surprised by her own boldness. "You're coming inside. Right now." "Clara, I can't." "Yes, you can and you will." She tugged at his arm and he followed, whether from surprise or because the fever had weakened him, she didn't know. She pushed him toward the bed where Sarah still slept peacefully. "Get in bed. I'll sleep on the floor with Sarah." "The hell you will," Gideon said, but his voice lacked conviction. Another cough shook him, and Clara saw him waver on his feet. "Gideon Zeller, you saved my life and my daughter's life. You have given us everything and asked for nothing in return. For once, just once, let someone take care of you." Clara's voice broke on the last word, surprising them both. Gideon looked at her, really looked at her, and something passed between them in that moment that had nothing to do with fever or guilt or gratitude. It was something raw and real, an acknowledgement of the thing that had been growing between them even as they both tried to ignore it. "All right," he said finally, "but you take the bed with Sarah. I'll sleep on the floor." It was a compromise, and Clara knew better than to push further. She helped him out of his boots and coat, trying not to notice the warmth of his skin through his shirt, the solid strength of his body. He settled onto the floor with the bedroll he brought in from the barn, and Clara tucked a blanket around him before climbing into the bed beside her daughter. But sleep eluded her. She lay in the darkness, listening to Gideon's ragged breathing, the occasional cough that he tried to muffle. After an hour, she heard him get up and stumble toward the water bucket. She lit a lamp and found him leaning against the table, his face pale and sheened with sweat. "Let me help," Clara said. She poured water into a cup and handed it to him, then dampened a cloth and pressed it to his forehead. He closed his eyes, swaying slightly, and she steadied him with a hand on his arm. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice rough. "Didn't mean to wake you." "Hush, you're burning up." Clara guided him back to the bedroll, and when he lay down, she knelt beside him, sponging his face and neck with the cool cloth. "You've been working yourself to exhaustion and sleeping in the cold. What did you think would happen?" "Didn't think," Gideon muttered. His eyes opened, focusing on her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Couldn't think about anything except keeping you safe, keeping you here." Clara's hand stilled. "What?" But his eyes had drifted closed again, and within moments, his breathing had deepened into the restless sleep of fever. Clara sat back on her heels, her heart pounding. Had he meant what she thought he meant? Or was it just the fever talking? She didn't sleep at all that night. She alternated between checking on Sarah and tending to Gideon, bringing him water when he woke, cooling his fever with damp cloths, covering him when he shivered. As dawn broke, painting the cabin in shades of gold and amber, she finally allowed herself to acknowledge what she'd been fighting for weeks. She was falling in love with Gideon Zeller. It was impossible, impractical, too fast, too complicated. She barely knew him. She was still grieving her husband, or she should be. But John's death, while tragic, hadn't broken her heart the way she thought a spouse's death should. Theirs had been a practical marriage, founded on companionship and mutual need rather than passion. She had cared for him, respected him, mourned him. But she had never felt for John what she was beginning to feel for the quiet cowboy who slept on the floor of his own cabin, because he believed she needed the bed more. Gideon's fever broke on the second day, but Clara insisted he rest for another full day after that. She brought him soup and bread, fluffed his pillow, and ignored his protests that he had work to do. "The cattle will survive without you for a few days," she said firmly. "And I checked on them this morning. They're fine." Gideon sat up straighter. "You went out to the pasture." "I did. Sarah and I both did. She's quite taken with that spotted heifer you mentioned, the one who's about to calve." Something that might have been admiration flickered in Gideon's eyes. "That's a decent walk." "I'm not as delicate as you seem to think," Clara said, with more bite than she intended. "I've recovered from my illness and I'm perfectly capable of helping with ranch work." "I never thought you were delicate," Gideon said quietly. "Anyone who tries to make it across the territory alone with a child and doesn't give up even when a wagon train abandons them, that's not delicate. That's steel wrapped in silk." Clara felt heat flood her face, and she busied herself straightening the blanket that didn't need straightening. "You should rest more, Clara." His hand caught hers, his grip warm and solid. "Thank you for taking care of me." She made herself meet his eyes, and what she saw there made her pulse race. It wasn't gratitude. It was something deeper, warmer, something that reflected back what she'd been feeling. "You're welcome," she managed. They stayed like that for a moment, hands clasped, something unspoken but undeniable stretching between them. Then Sarah called from outside, and Clara gently pulled her hand free, the spell broken. But it wasn't gone. It was there in the days that followed, in every glance and accidental touch, in the way Gideon watched her work in the garden, and the way Clara found reasons to be near him when he was mending tack or chopping wood. It was there in the evenings when they sat at the table after Sarah had gone to bed, talking about nothing and everything, their voices low in the lamplight. Clara learned that Gideon had come west from Missouri after his parents died, that he'd worked as a ranch hand for 3 years before saving enough to buy his own land. He told her about the first winter, when he'd lived in a dugout and nearly froze, about the drought that had almost broken him, about the slow, stubborn satisfaction of building something with his own hands. And Clara told him about her life before, about John's shop and the quiet, orderly existence they'd built, about Sarah's birth and the joy that had brought, about the pneumonia that had taken John so suddenly that Clara had barely had time to say goodbye. She told him about her sister Emma's letters, full of descriptions of Oklahoma territory and opportunities and fresh starts, and how Clara had sold everything to buy passage on a wagon train west. "I haven't tried to find her," Clara admitted one evening in late October. Emma. I should go into Kingfisher, ask around. Why haven't you? Gideon's voice was carefully neutral. Because I don't want to leave, Clara thought. Because this cabin has become more of a home in 6 weeks than anywhere I've lived in years. Because I think I might be in love with you, and if I find Emma, I'll have no excuse to stay. I will, she said instead. Soon. But the days turned into weeks, and Clara didn't go into Kingfisher. She told herself she was waiting until she was stronger, until Sarah was more settled, until the weather was better. The truth was, she was terrified of what she might find or not find, and what it would mean either way. The first frost came in early November, painting the world in shades of white and silver. Clara woke to find ice crystals on the inside of the window, and her breath misting in the air. She rose quietly, trying not to wake Sarah, and went to stoke the fire in the stove. Gideon was already up, of course, feeding logs into the flames. Morning, he said, his voice still rough with sleep. Good morning. Clara moved to the stove, putting water on to boil for coffee. They worked in companionable silence, their movements synchronized after weeks of sharing the small space. When the coffee was ready, Clara poured 2 cups and handed one to Gideon. First frost, he said, wrapping his hands around the cup. Winter's coming early this year. Clara felt a flutter of anxiety. Winter. She couldn't possibly stay through the winter. People would talk, and even in this rough territory where social niceties were often relaxed, there were limits to what was acceptable. A widow and an unmarried man living together would be scandalous. I need to go into Kingfisher, she said abruptly. Today, to find Emma. Gideon was quiet for a long moment. All right, I'll hitch up the wagon. The ride into Kingfisher took the better part of 2 hours, the wagon rattling over the rutted road. Sarah sat between them, chattering excitedly about seeing a real town. Clara tried to share her daughter's enthusiasm, but dread sat like a stone in her stomach. Kingfisher was larger than Clara had expected, a bustling town of perhaps 500 souls. Buildings lined the main street, including a general store, a bank, a hotel, a saloon, and a church with a white-painted steeple. People moved along the wooden sidewalks, bundled against the cold. Gideon pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the general store. Best place to start asking questions, he said. The store was warm and crowded, smelling of coffee and leather and tobacco. A portly man with spectacles stood behind the counter, and he looked up with a smile as they entered. Help you folks? He asked. I'm looking for my sister, Clara said. Emma Johnson. She was homesteading somewhere near here. The man's expression shifted, becoming sympathetic in a way that made Clara's heart sink. Johnson Place, yes. I'm afraid I've got bad news for you, madam. Mrs. Johnson and her husband died of typhoid last spring. Terrible thing. They're buried in the church cemetery. The floor seemed to tilt beneath Clara's feet. Emma dead. Her one plan, her one hope for a future gone. Did they have any children? Clara heard herself ask. No, madam. It was just the 2 of them. The land reverted to the territory when they passed. I'm real sorry. Clara nodded numbly, unable to find words. She felt Gideon's hand at her elbow, steadying her, and she let him guide her out of the store and back to the wagon. Sarah was asking questions, but Clara couldn't process them. All she could think was that she had nowhere to go, no plan, no future. Clara. Gideon's voice was low and urgent. Look at me. She lifted her eyes to his, and the concern she saw there nearly undid her. You're not alone, he said. Do you understand me? You and Sarah, you have a place. With me? Gideon, I can't just live with you. People will talk. It's not proper. Then marry me. The words hung in the cold air between them. Sarah gasped, and Clara realized her daughter was listening to every word. What? Clara whispered. Marry me, Gideon said again. He took her hands in his grip strong and sure. "I know this isn't how these things are usually done. I don't have pretty words or a fancy courtship, but I care about you, Clara, about both of you. These past 2 months, having you in my home, in my life, it's been the best time I can remember. I don't want it to end." "You don't know what you're asking," Clara said, but her voice shook. "Marriage is forever. I know that. I'm 26 years old and I've never asked anyone before because I've never felt like this before." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer. "I slept in the barn for 6 weeks without a word because you needed the bed more. I'd sleep in the barn for the rest of my life if that's what you needed. But what I want, what I'm hoping you might want too, is to share that bed, to share everything, to build a life together." Clara's eyes burned with tears. It was too fast, too sudden, too perfect. How could she say yes when she'd only known him 2 months? How could she say no when everything in her heart was screaming yes? "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Anything. When you had the fever, you said something. You said you couldn't think about anything except keeping me safe, keeping me there. Did you mean it?" Color rose in Gideon's weathered cheeks. "I meant it. I've been half in love with you since you woke up in my bed, and the first thing you did was worry about your daughter. Fell the rest of the way when you came out into the cold in your bare feet to take care of me when I was sick." A sob caught in Clara's throat, but it was one of joy, not sorrow. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you." The smile that broke across Gideon's face was like sunrise, and when he pulled her into his arms, Clara went willingly, burying her face against his chest. She could hear his heart pounding, rapid and strong, matching her own. "Can I call you Papa?" Sarah asked, her small voice breaking into the moment. Gideon released Clara and knelt down to Sarah's level. "I'd be honored," he said seriously, "if that's what you want." Sarah threw her arms around his neck, and Clara saw Gideon's eyes close, his expression one of profound emotion. When he stood, lifting Sarah with him, he reached out and pulled Clara close again, the three of them forming a small circle in the middle of the street. They were married the next day in the white-painted church, with the minister and his wife as witnesses. Clara wore the best dress she owned, and Gideon had shaved and slicked back his hair, looking almost uncomfortable in a clean shirt and string tie. Sarah stood beside them, beaming, and when Gideon slipped a simple gold band onto Clara's finger, his hand trembled. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the minister said. "You may kiss your bride." Gideon looked at Clara, a question in his eyes, and she smiled and nodded. His kiss was gentle, almost hesitant, a question rather than a claim. Clara's hand came up to rest against his cheek, and she kissed him back with all the hope and trust and tentative love she'd been holding inside. When they broke apart, Gideon rested his forehead against hers for a moment, his eyes closed. "Thank you," he whispered. They drove back to the ranch as the sun was setting, painting the prairie in shades of gold and crimson. Sarah fell asleep between them, exhausted by the excitement of the day. Clara watched the familiar landscape roll by and realized with a start that she was happy. Truly, deeply happy in a way she hadn't been in longer than she could remember. "Having second thoughts?" Gideon asked quietly. "Not even one," Clara said. She reached over Sarah's sleeping form and took his hand. "Are you?" "No, madam. Best decision I ever made." That night, after Sarah was asleep in the bed, they'd moved to a corner of the cabin. Gideon and Clara stood together in the center of the room, suddenly shy with each other. The reality of what they'd done, the commitment they'd made, seemed to fill the space between them. "I built that bed," Gideon said, nodding toward the corner where a second bed frame stood, the one he'd been working on for weeks. "Figured we'd want our privacy." Clara looked at the bed, at the care he'd put into every joint and the delicate carvings that decorated the headboard. Flowers and vines, rendered with surprising skill. "It's beautiful," she said. "So are you." Clara turned to find Gideon watching her with an expression that made her breath catch. In the lamplight, his eyes were dark and intent, and she could see the desire there, held carefully in check. "I'm nervous," she admitted. "Me too." He crossed to her, moving slowly, giving her time to retreat if she wanted. "We can take this slow, Clara. We've got the rest of our lives." But Clara didn't want slow. She'd been cautious and practical her whole life, making sensible choices, doing what was expected. For once, she wanted to follow her heart, to embrace this wild, wonderful thing that had happened to her. She reached up and touched his face, feeling the rasp of stubble beneath her fingers. "I want this," she said. "I want you." Gideon's kiss was different this time, deeper, full of restrained passion. His hands found her waist, drawing her close, and Clara melted into him, into the warmth and strength and rightness of being in his arms. When he lifted her and carried her to the new bed, she went willingly, and the tenderness with which he loved her that night drove away any lingering doubts she might have had. Later, as she lay with her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, Gideon's arm wrapped around her, Clara thought about the journey that had brought her here. The death and loss, the fever and desperation, the chance encounter on a prairie road that had changed everything. She thought about Emma, about the sister she'd never see again, and felt a pang of sorrow. But beneath the sorrow was gratitude, because if Emma's letters hadn't brought her west, she never would have met Gideon. "What are you thinking?" Gideon asked, his voice a low rumble in the darkness. "That I'm glad the wagon train left me," Clara said. "That's terrible, isn't it?" "No, it's honest." His arm tightened around her. "I'm glad, too, most glad I've ever been about anything." The winter that followed was hard, as first winters in Oklahoma Territory tended to be. There were blizzards that kept them snowbound for days, and temperatures that dropped so low that water froze in the bucket overnight despite the fire. But inside the cabin, there was warmth. Clara threw herself into making the small space a real home, sewing curtains for the windows and braiding a rug for the floor. She learned to bake bread in the temperamental stove, and to make stew that could stretch to feed them for days when the weather was too fierce for Gideon to hunt. And Gideon, who had been so alone for so long, seemed to unfold in the presence of family. He taught Sarah to whittle, showing her how to coax shapes from wood with patient instruction. He brought Clara wildflowers even in the dead of winter, finding them in sheltered spots where the snow hadn't reached. He held her at night and talked about his dreams for the ranch, for the life they would build together. In January, Clara realized she was pregnant. She'd suspected for a few weeks, but hadn't been certain until the sickness started, the same roiling nausea she remembered from carrying Sarah. She told Gideon one evening after Sarah had gone to bed, watching his face carefully for his reaction. He went very still, his eyes dropping to her stomach. "A baby, yes, probably due in late summer, Clara." Her name was a prayer and a promise. He reached out and placed his hand gently over her stomach, his palm warm through the fabric of her dress. "We're going to have a baby. Are you happy?" she asked, suddenly uncertain. Happy doesn't begin to cover it. He pulled her into his arms, holding her as though she were made of spun glass. "You've given me everything. A home, a family, and now this. I never thought I'd have any of it." "You gave me those things first," Clara said, her voice muffled against his chest. "You saved my life, Gideon. Mine and Sarah's. Everything good that's come after is because of you." They stood like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, marveling at the strange and beautiful turn their lives had taken. The pregnancy progressed through the spring, and as Clara's belly swelled, Gideon became increasingly protective. He wouldn't let her lift anything heavy or work in the garden for more than an hour at a time. He brought her water constantly, worried that she wasn't drinking enough. At night, he would rest his hand on her stomach, his expression one of wonder when the baby kicked. "Do you want a boy or a girl?" Clara asked him one evening in May as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky. "Don't care," Gideon said. "Long as the baby's healthy and you come through the birth all right, I'll be fine. I've done this before, remember. Doesn't stop me from worrying." He took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "You're everything to me, Clara. You and Sarah and this baby if anything happened to you." "Nothing will happen to me," Clara said firmly. "I'm strong, Gideon, stronger than you think." "I know how strong you are, doesn't mean I don't worry." Sarah was delighted about the baby, constantly talking to Clara's stomach and bringing small gifts, flowers, and interesting rocks that she arranged carefully on the table. She helped Gideon build a cradle, handing him tools and watching intently as he fitted the pieces together. At 9 years old now, she was growing tall and confident, her earlier trauma fading in the security of their new life. "I'm going to be the best big sister," Sarah declared one afternoon. "I'll teach the baby everything I know." "That's a lucky baby then," Clara said, smoothing Sarah's hair back from her face. "Having such a wonderful sister." In late August, as the heat pressed down like a weight and the prairie grass turned gold, Clara went into labor. It started in the early morning, a tightening across her belly that she recognized immediately. She woke Gideon, who shot out of bed as though stung. "I'll get the doctor," he said, already reaching for his boots. "There's time," Clara said, managing a smile despite the discomfort. "First babies take a while, and even second ones usually give you some warning. But yes, you should probably ride into town." Gideon was dressed and out the door within minutes, and Clara heard the thunder of his horses' hooves racing away. Sarah had woken with the commotion, and Clara explained what was happening, trying to keep her voice calm even as another contraction gripped her. "Is it going to hurt a lot?" Sarah asked, her eyes wide. "Yes," Clara said honestly, "but it's worth it. You were worth every moment of pain, and this baby will be too." The doctor arrived with Gideon 2 hours later, a gruff older man named Dr. Patterson who delivered half the babies in Kingfisher. He examined Clara efficiently and pronounced that everything was progressing normally. "Send the girl outside," he said to Gideon. "And you might want to go with her. This isn't something a husband needs to see." But Clara reached out and grabbed Gideon's hand. "Stay," she said, "please." Gideon looked at the doctor, who shrugged. "Your choice, but don't say I didn't warn you." What followed were hours of pain and effort, Clara's body working to bring new life into the world. Gideon stayed beside her the entire time, letting her grip his hand hard enough to bruise, wiping the sweat from her face, murmuring encouragement. When the pain was at its worst, when Clara was certain she couldn't endure another moment, he held her and reminded her that she was the strongest person he knew. "You survived a fever that should have killed you," he said. "You made it across half the territory alone. You can do this, Clara. I know you can." And she did. As the sun was setting, painting the cabin in shades of amber and gold, Clara gave one final push and felt the release as the baby slid into the doctor's waiting hands. For a moment, there was silence and Clara's heart stopped. Then a loud, indignant wail filled the air and Dr. Patterson laughed. "You've got a son," he said, holding up the squalling infant, "and he's got a good set of lungs on him. A son." Clara watched through tears as the doctor cleaned the baby and wrapped him in a blanket, then placed him in her arms. He was perfect, tiny and red-faced, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that would probably be gray like his father's. "Gideon," she whispered. Look at our son." Gideon was staring at the baby with an expression of such profound awe that it made Clara's chest ache. He reached out tentatively, letting the infant wrap a tiny fist around his finger. "He's perfect," Gideon said, his voice rough with emotion. "You're perfect. Thank you, Clara. Thank you for this." They named him James, after Gideon's father, and from the moment he entered the world, he was loved beyond measure. Sarah was enchanted with her baby brother, wanting to hold him constantly, and Gideon took to fatherhood with the same quiet competence he brought to everything else. He would get up with Clara in the night when James needed feeding, keeping her company in the darkness, and sometimes Clara would wake to find Gideon standing over the cradle, just watching the baby sleep. The years that followed were full of hard work and simple joys. The ranch grew slowly but steadily, and Gideon was able to hire on a couple of ranch hands to help with the work. They built an addition to the cabin, adding 2 more rooms so that Sarah could have her own space and James could have a nursery. Clara's garden flourished, providing vegetables through the summer and canned goods for the winter. When James was 2, Clara became pregnant again, and this time it was a girl they named Ruth. Sarah was 11 by then, old enough to be a real help with the babies, and she took the responsibility seriously. 2 years after Ruth came another boy, Thomas, and the little cabin that had once housed a solitary cowboy was suddenly bursting with life and noise and love. Gideon thrived in the chaos. He built Sarah a bookshelf when she discovered a love of reading, ordering books from catalogs and presenting them to her on her birthdays. He carved toys for the younger children, little horses and dolls that became treasured possessions. He taught James to ride almost as soon as the boy could walk, settling him in the saddle and leading the old mare around the corral while James shrieked with delight. And through it all, through the daily struggles and small triumphs, through sick children and broken fences and seasons of drought, Clara and Gideon's love deepened. It wasn't the passionate, reckless romance of storybooks. It was something quieter, steadier, forged in shared work and mutual respect. It was the way Gideon still brought her wildflowers, and the way Clara still made his favorite meals even after years of marriage. It was the conversations they had in the evening after the children were asleep, the plans they made, the dreams they shared. One evening in the spring of 1890, 7 years after they'd married, Clara and Gideon sat together on the porch, watching their children play in the yard. Sarah was 15 now, turning into a young woman, her attention increasingly drawn to the son of a neighboring rancher. James was 5, Ruth 3, and Thomas just learning to walk. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, and the air smelled of fresh grass and growing things. "You ever think about that day?" Clara asked. "When you found me on the road, all the time," Gideon said. He reached over and took her hand, their fingers intertwining with long practice. "Best day of my life finding you. You were so quiet," Clara said, smiling at the memory. "I thought you were just being kind, letting us stay. I had no idea you were falling in love with me. Didn't know how to say it. Wasn't sure you'd want to hear it. You were grieving and scared, and the last thing you needed was some cowboy making things complicated. But you slept in the barn," Clara said softly. "For 6 months, Gideon. Even after we were married, even after I begged you to take your bed back, you insisted on building a new one rather than let me and Sarah be uncomfortable. You needed the bed more," Gideon said simply. "It was that straightforward. I had options, you didn't. And seeing you get stronger, watching Sarah stop being so scared, that was worth more than any comfort." Clara turned to him, reaching up to cup his face in her hand. After 7 years and 4 children, after countless nights in his arms and days by his side, the sight of him still made her heart skip a beat. "I love you," she said. "I don't say it enough, but I do, more than I ever thought possible." "I know," Gideon said. He turned his head and kissed her palm. I love you too. You're still the best thing that ever happened to me." They sat in comfortable silence, watching as Sarah helped James catch fireflies while Ruth toddled after them and Thomas sat in the grass, fascinated by a ladybug crawling on his hand. This was their life now, Clara thought. This beautiful, chaotic, imperfect life that had grown from the ashes of loss and the generosity of a quiet cowboy who'd given everything and asked for nothing. By 1895, Sarah was married to that neighboring rancher's son, a good man named William who treated her with respect and affection. She lived just 5 miles away, close enough to visit often, and was expecting her first child. James was 10 and already showing signs of his father's quiet competence, able to ride as well as many of the ranch hands and interested in every aspect of the cattle business. Ruth was 8, a bright, spirited girl who loved horses and wasn't afraid of hard work. Thomas was 6, and Clara had recently discovered she was pregnant again, a surprise after she'd thought they were done having children. "We're going to need a bigger house," Gideon said when she told him, but he was grinning. "I think you're right," Clara agreed. She was 40 now, and this pregnancy felt different from the others, harder somehow. But she was healthy and strong, and the local midwife assured her that everything was progressing normally. In the late summer, Clara gave birth to their 5th child, another girl they named Grace. She was small and perfect, with Clara's dark hair and Gideon's gray eyes, and she completed their family in a way Clara hadn't known they needed. The years continued to pass, each one bringing changes and challenges. There were hard times, years when the cattle prices dropped or the weather turned brutal, and there were good times, harvests that exceeded expectations and winters that were mild. Through it all, Clara and Gideon faced everything together, their partnership unshakable. They expanded the ranch to 500 acres, buying the property that had belonged to Clara's sister and her husband. It seemed fitting somehow that Clara should end up with the land Emma had written about so passionately. She planted roses on Emma's grave, tending them carefully each summer. James grew into a fine young man, steady and reliable like his father, and when he was 21, he took over most of the day-to-day running of the ranch. Thomas followed in his brother's footsteps, while Ruth surprised everyone by announcing her intention to become a teacher. Grace, the baby, was spoiled by everyone and grew up bright and confident, with a quick wit and a kind heart. Sarah gave them 6 grandchildren over the years, and nothing delighted Gideon more than having those little ones running around the ranch. He was patient with them in a way he'd never been patient with anything else, answering their endless questions and teaching them the same skills he'd taught his own children. Clara watched him one afternoon in 1910, when he was 53 and she was 45, as he helped their youngest grandson learn to rope a fence post. His hair was more gray than dark now, and there were deep lines around his eyes, but he moved with the same quiet confidence he always had. "You're staring," Gideon said, catching her watching. "I'm admiring," Clara corrected. "There's a difference." He walked over to her, leaving the boy to practice on his own. "What are you admiring?" "The life we built," Clara said. She gestured to the ranch spread out before them, to the house they'd expanded over the years, to the children and grandchildren that filled it with noise and love. "All of this. Everything we've become." Gideon pulled her close and she rested her head against his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of him. "Couldn't have done it without you," he said. "We did it together," Clara corrected. "That's what matters." They stood like that for a while, holding each other, watching their grandson master the rope technique. The prairie stretched out around them, golden in the afternoon sun, the same prairie where their story had begun 27 years earlier. "You ever regret it?" Clara asked suddenly. "Taking in 2 strangers, Changing your whole life. Not for a single second, Gideon said. He pulled back enough to look at her, his gray eyes serious. That was the day my life really started. Everything before that was just waiting. Clara's eyes filled with tears, though she was smiling. After all these years, he could still surprise her with his words, still make her fall in love with him all over again. I was so scared that day, she admitted. When I woke up in your cabin, I thought I'd failed Sarah, that we were going to die. And then there you were, this quiet cowboy who just took care of everything without asking for anything. I asked for something eventually, Gideon said, a rare smile tugging at his mouth. Asked you to marry me in the middle of Kingfisher's Main Street, not my smoothest moment, Clara laughed. It was perfect. You were perfect. You still are. They walked back to the house hand in hand, their grandson trailing behind them. That evening, the whole family gathered for supper, cramming around the big table that Gideon had built years ago when it became clear the old one was too small. There was laughter and conversation, children's voices mixing with adults, the clink of silverware and the scrape of chairs, all the beautiful chaos of a large, loving family. Clara looked around the table at each beloved face and felt gratitude wash over her like a wave. She thought about the wagon train that had abandoned her, about the fever that had nearly killed her, about the choice to take a chance on an uncertain future. Every moment of fear and pain had led her here, to this table, to this family, to this man sitting beside her who still sometimes looked at her as though she was something precious and miraculous. As the years advanced, they settled into the comfortable rhythms of older age. Gideon's joints ached on cold mornings, and Clara's hands weren't as steady as they used to be, but they were healthy and active, still working alongside their children to run the ranch. They celebrated their 30th anniversary in 1913, and Sarah organized a party that brought together friends and family from all over the territory. 30 years, Clara said that night, after everyone had gone home and she and Gideon were alone in their room. It feels like forever and no time at all. Best 30 years of my life, Gideon said. He was sitting on the edge of the bed and Clara came to stand in front of him. He wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his head against her stomach the way he used to when she was pregnant. Every single day with you has been a gift. Clara ran her fingers through his hair, now almost completely gray. I never thanked you properly, she said. For what? For sleeping in the barn, for giving us everything, for being patient with me when I was too scared to admit how I felt. Gideon looked up at her, and in his eyes she could still see the young man who'd found her on that dusty road. You needed the bed more, he said simply. And I needed you. Worked out well for both of us. Clara bent down and kissed him, pouring 3 decades of love into that simple gesture. When she pulled back, Gideon was smiling, that rare, brilliant smile that still made her heart race. They made love that night with the tenderness of long practice, taking comfort in the familiar landscape of each other's bodies. Afterward, Clara lay with her head on Gideon's chest, listening to his heartbeat, steady and strong. You think we'll have another 30 years? She asked. I don't know, Gideon said honestly, but I know I'll spend every day I've left loving you. In the spring of 1920, they celebrated their 37th anniversary. James was 41 now and ran the ranch with his brother Thomas, both married with children of their own. Ruth had become a beloved teacher in Kingfisher, unmarried by choice and content with her life. Grace, at 25, had just gotten married to a lawyer from Oklahoma City. Sarah, at 45, had recently become a grandmother herself, making Clara and Gideon great-grandparents. It was a warm May afternoon when Clara and Gideon took a ride out to the spot where he'd found her all those years ago. They didn't go often, but sometimes the urge struck them to revisit that place where their story began. They dismounted and stood looking at the empty prairie, so much the same and yet so changed. "I remember seeing you kneeling beside your daughter," Gideon said quietly. "The wagon was tilted with that busted wheel, and you looked so fierce, like you were ready to fight off death itself with your bare hands." "I felt like I was dying," Clara said. "Everything hurt and I was so hot and all I could think was that I'd failed Sarah. But you didn't fail her. You never gave up. That's what I saw first before I saw how beautiful you were. I saw your strength." Clara leaned against him, and his arm came around her automatically. "You saw more in me than I saw in myself. You gave me the space to become strong again." "I gave you a bed and some soup," Gideon said with characteristic modesty. "You did the rest." "You gave me everything," Clara corrected. "A home, a family, a life I never dreamed I could have. You loved me when I was barely capable of loving myself." They stayed there for a while, two people who had grown old together, whose love had weathered every storm and emerged stronger. When they finally mounted their horses to ride back, Clara felt a deep sense of peace. Whatever time they had left, whether it was days or years, they would face it together. As it turned out, they had several more good years. They watched their grandchildren and great-grandchildren grow, saw the ranch continue to prosper under James and Thomas's management, celebrated Ruth's decision to adopt a child, and welcomed Grace's 3 babies. They grew frailer as the years passed, moving slower, resting more, but their minds remained sharp and their love for each other never dimmed. One evening in the late autumn of 1925, when Gideon was 68 and Clara was 60, they sat together on the porch watching the sunset. It had become their favorite time of day, these quiet moments when the work was done and they could simply be together. "I want you to know something," Gideon said, his voice soft in the gathering dusk. "These 42 years with you have been more than I ever deserved. Every morning I wake up beside you, I'm grateful." "Gideon," Clara turned to him, seeing the seriousness in his expression. "Where is this coming from?" "Just want to make sure you know," he said. He took her hand, his grip still strong despite his age. "That first day when I saw you on that road, something in me recognized something in you, like we were always meant to find each other." "I believe that," Clara said. "I believe we were meant to be." They sat in silence as the stars began to emerge one by one in the darkening sky. The prairie stretched out before them, vast and beautiful, the same prairie that had witnessed their meeting, their marriage, the raising of their family, every moment of their shared life. Gideon lived another 10 years, making it to 78 before his heart finally gave out one quiet morning in 1935. He died peacefully in his sleep, Clara beside him as she had been for 52 years. The grief nearly broke her, but she took comfort in their children and grandchildren, in the legacy they had built together, in the certainty that they had loved each other well. Clara lived another 5 years after Gideon's passing, remaining active and involved in the ranch and the family until the very end. When she died in 1940 at the age of 75, her last words were of Gideon, and there was a smile on her face. They were buried together on a hill overlooking the ranch, under a massive oak tree that Gideon had planted the year they were married. The headstone was simple, bearing their names and dates, but someone, probably Sarah, had added a line beneath. He gave her shelter, she gave him a home. Together they built a love that lasted a lifetime. The ranch continued through the generations, passed down to James's children and then to their children. The house was expanded and modernized, but the original cabin was preserved, kept as a reminder of where it all started. Family gatherings still happened there, and the story of Gideon and Clara was passed down. becoming legend. The tale of the cowboy who slept in the barn for 6 months without a word because he believed that the widow and her daughter needed the bed more, and how that simple act of kindness had blossomed into a love that defined them all. On quiet evenings, when the sun set over the Oklahoma prairie, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, those who knew the story would sometimes stand on that hill where Gideon and Clara were buried and think about the power of compassion, the strength of love, and the beautiful things that could grow from the smallest acts of grace. The story of Gideon and Clara Zeller became a touchstone for the family, a reminder of what really mattered. In a world that often seemed harsh and unforgiving, their love stood as proof that kindness existed, that people could choose to care for strangers, that love could bloom in the most unexpected places. Sarah, who lived to be 93, would tell the story to her great-great-grandchildren, her eyes still bright with the memory of that day in Kingfisher when Gideon had proposed to her mother in the middle of the street. "He was so nervous," she would say. "His hands were shaking when he took Mama's hands, but his voice was steady when he asked her to marry him. He knew what he wanted, and he wasn't afraid to ask for it." James would remember the patient way his father had taught him about ranching, about life, about what it meant to be a good man. "He never raised his voice," James would tell his own sons. "Never had to. When Pa spoke, you listened because you knew he'd thought carefully about what he wanted to say, and he loved Ma with everything he had. That's the kind of man I've tried to be." Ruth would talk about the way her parents had supported her unconventional choices, how they'd never pressured her to marry or conform to expectations. "They understood that love takes many forms," she would say. "They loved each other, yes, but they also loved us enough to let us be ourselves." Thomas would speak of his father's work ethic, the way Gideon had built something from nothing through sheer determination and careful planning. "But he never let work come before family," Thomas would add. "He worked hard so we could have a good life, but he always made time for us. Always." And Grace, the baby, would remember sitting on her father's lap while he told her stories, the deep rumble of his voice, the safety of his arms around her. "He made me feel like I could do anything," she would say. "Like the world was full of possibilities. That's the gift he gave all of us." The decades rolled on, and the world changed in ways that Gideon and Clara never could have imagined. Oklahoma became a state in 1907, just a few years after their story began in the territory. The automobile replaced the horse, electricity came to even remote ranches, 2 world wars transformed the nation, and technology advanced at a dizzying pace. But on the Zeller Ranch, some things remained constant. The land was still worked with care and respect. Families still gathered around tables for meals, still told stories, still passed down the values that Gideon and Clara had exemplified. The love they had shared became a foundation on which generations built their lives. In 1983, exactly 100 years after Gideon had found Clara on that dusty road, the family organized a massive reunion at the ranch. Descendants came from all over the country, some who still worked the land, others who had moved to cities and pursued different dreams. But they all knew the story. They all understood where they came from. A great-great-grandson, a history professor named David, gave a speech that day. He stood on the porch of the original cabin, looking out at the crowd of family members, and talked about what Gideon and Clara's story meant. In 1883, this territory was still being shaped, he said. People came west looking for opportunities for land, for new beginnings. Gideon Zeller was one of those people. He carved a ranch out of nothing, built a home with his own hands, created something lasting. But he didn't do it alone. When he found Clara and Clara Jenkins on that road, he made a choice. He could have kept riding. He could have brought them to town and left them there. Instead, he took them home. He gave them his bed and slept in the barn. For 6 months, he put their comfort and safety above his own. David paused, looking around at the crowd. That choice changed everything. It created the family we are today. But more than that, it showed us what kind of man Gideon was and what kind of woman Clara was. They both had the courage to take a chance on love, to build something together, to create a legacy that has lasted 100 years. There were tears in many eyes as David finished speaking. The story had been told countless times, but it never lost its power. It was a reminder of the best of what people could be, of the beauty that could come from simple acts of kindness. As the sun set that day, casting long shadows across the prairie, the family gathered on the hill where Gideon and Clara were buried. Someone had placed fresh wildflowers on the grave, the kind of simple prairie flowers that Gideon used to bring Clara. They stood in silence for a moment, each person lost in their own thoughts, their own connections to the couple who had started it all. Then Sarah's great-granddaughter, a young woman named Emily who was studying to be a writer, read a poem she had written about Gideon and Clara. It captured the essence of their story, the quiet heroism of everyday love, the power of choosing kindness, the beauty of a life built on mutual respect and care. When she finished, the family spontaneously began to sing, an old hymn that Gideon and Clara had loved, their voices rising into the evening air, carrying across the prairie they had worked and loved. It was a moment of pure connection, spanning generations, linking past to present to future. The Zeller Ranch continued into the 21st century, adapted and changed, but still fundamentally the same. The descendants of Gideon and Clara faced new challenges, navigated changing economies and climates and technologies. But they carried with them the lessons learned from that cowboy and widow who had found each other on a dusty Oklahoma road in 1883. They learned that kindness mattered, that giving someone else what they needed, even at cost to yourself, was never wasted. They learned that love could bloom in unexpected places, between unexpected people, if you were brave enough to open your heart. They learned that strength came in many forms, that sometimes the strongest thing you could do was accept help, and sometimes it was offering it. They learned that a life well lived wasn't measured in wealth or fame, but in relationships nurtured, in children raised with love, in work done with integrity, in moments of connection and grace. Gideon and Clara had never been rich by the world's standards. They had worked hard their entire lives, faced setbacks and challenges, known loss and grief. But they had loved each other deeply and raised a family that knew what it meant to be loved, and that legacy proved more valuable than any amount of money. The story of the cowboy who slept in the barn for 6 months became more than just family history. It became a parable about what mattered most in life, about the choices we make and the lives we build from them. It reminded each generation that their actions had consequences, that small kindnesses could ripple outward in ways they might never fully understand, that love was always worth the risk. And so the story lived on, told and retold, adapted and embellished perhaps, but always true in its essentials. On quiet evenings, when families gathered and conversation turned to the past, someone would inevitably mention Gideon and Clara. The young people would lean forward, eager to hear the tale again, and the old people would smile, remembering their own connections to that love story that had shaped them all. He slept in the barn for 6 months without a word, the storyteller would say, because he believed that Clara and Sarah needed the bed more. He never asked for anything in return. He just gave because that's the kind of man he was. And someone else would add, but Clara gave back. She gave him a home, a family, a love that sustained him through all the hard years of ranch life. They gave to each other, constantly, generously, without keeping score. That's what love is, an elder might conclude, looking around at the gathered family. Not grand gestures or passionate declarations, though those have their place. Real love is sleeping in the barn because someone else needs the bed. It's showing up every day, doing the work, making the choice to care even when it's hard. Gideon and Clara understood that, and they built something beautiful because of it. The conversations would continue late into the night, as they always did when family gathered. Stories would branch and multiply, connecting Gideon and Clara's tale to other family legends, weaving a tapestry of memory and meaning. And always at the center was that image of the tall, quiet cowboy walking out to the barn as dusk fell, carrying his bedroll, leaving the comfort of his home to strangers because it was the right thing to do. That image, more than anything else, captured the essence of who Gideon Zeller had been. Not a saint, not a hero in the traditional sense, just a man who tried to do right by people, who saw a need and responded to it, who valued others' comfort above his own. And Clara, the widow who had found the courage to accept that help, to trust again, to open her heart to new love even when she was still raw from loss. Together, they had created something that lasted far beyond their lifetimes, a love that became legend, a family that continued to grow and thrive, a legacy that reminded everyone who heard the story what was possible when people chose kindness over indifference, connection over isolation, love over fear. As the 21st century progressed and the world continued to change in dizzying ways, the Zeller family held fast to the lessons of their ancestors. They adapted to new realities while maintaining core values. They used modern technology to stay connected across distances, but still gathered in person when they could, still told the old stories, still visited the ranch and stood on that hill overlooking the prairie where it all began. And each time they told the story of Gideon and Clara, of the cowboy who slept in the barn and the widow who learned to love again. They renewed their commitment to living with that same spirit of generosity and grace. They carried forward the legacy not just in words but in actions, in the ways they treated others, in the families they built, in the choices they made each day. The story of Gideon and Clara Zeller, which began with an act of simple kindness on a dusty Oklahoma road in 1883, continued to ripple outward, touching lives, shaping hearts, reminding people of what mattered most. It was a story of its time and for all time, a tale of love found in unexpected places, of strength born from vulnerability, of the extraordinary things that could grow from ordinary acts of goodness. And so the legend lived on, passed down from generation to generation, a treasured inheritance more valuable than land or money, a reminder that the most important legacy anyone could leave was not measured in material wealth, but in love given, kindness shown, and lives touched. Gideon had given Clara his bed, and she had given him her heart, and from that exchange a beautiful, lasting love had bloomed, proving that sometimes the simplest gifts are the most profound, and the smallest acts of compassion can change the world.